A few nice prizes, and here's MG.
67th Street in New York City, that is the site of the Soviet mission to the United Nations, and it is where Mikhail Gorbachev has spent what has been a very active night for him as they've made some decisions to return home on short notice because of the terrible earthquake that has struck Armenia in the southern part of the Soviet Union. Original estimates have 30,000 to 50,000 people dead in that area, which has been hit as well by political unrest. As you know, the Soviet president was scheduled to spend this day in New York with a reception tonight and go on to Cuba tomorrow and Great Britain from there. But late last night, shortly after midnight, the Soviet foreign minister announced that Mikhail Gorbachev would be returning. NBC's Stan Bernard is on 67th Street. Stan?
Tom, the car is just moving out now past our camera position. They are going to make a left turn up 3rd Avenue, which has been closed for the past 2 hours. The entire northern part of 3rd Avenue closed. And they're going to retrace the route that they took when they came in just a few days ago. The cars are moving up toward 96th Street. We'll then turn on to the FDR Drive and across the Triborough Bridge and go all the way out to Queens. It should take them about 25 minutes to get out to Kennedy Airport from here.
Right. For those, most of our audience, of course, Stanley, not familiar with the details of the geography of New York, this is one of the most active commercial and residential areas in the city, and they have cleared it out, although for the past couple of days when Gorbachev has been moving around, the city has handled it pretty well. The rest of the time, traffic has moved, in fact, better than normally because a lot of people took the advice of Mayor Koch, which was to park their car or sell it. They weren't driving while Gorbachev was in the city. Did the Soviet president have anything to say, or did he just come out of the mission and get into his car, Stan?
Tom, he just got into his car. We waited a long time for him. He was supposed to leave originally at 11:15, and then the time got moved to 11:50. There was great anticipation about the move because these streets on the Upper East Side, as you pointed out, very busy area, completely blocked off for the last 2 hours. And of course, the crush was on here, and then we began to move. He is now cleared out of the area. He said absolutely nothing while he was here, and he just simply moved out. I think this is going to be a very serious ride home.
Stan, we'll ask you to stand by there, and we're going to go now to the airport as we watch this motorcade make its way with New York City police, Soviet security, U.S. federal security, make its way out to Kennedy Airport, only 15 miles. For most of you who come to New York and make that ride, it takes 45 minutes to an hour, $25 for a cab. It's a little quicker in this way, and a little more expensive for the city of New York because of all the security that was necessary for the leader of the Soviet Union. At the airport, Bob Abernathy and John Cochran standing by, the top-ranking American official in the U.S. mission to the United Nations. John and Bob?
That's right, Tom. This is the Deputy Ambassador to the UN in the United States delegation, Mr. Herbert Orkin. He also is a former ambassador to East Germany. So we've got several things to talk about. First of all, the Gorbachev troop cuts proposals. Many of those would take place in East Germany. Were you surprised, and do you think they're substantial, serious, and things that we should be really quite pleased about?
Well, they have to take place in East Germany and other countries because the group of Soviet forces there is very large. It's on the front lines. In terms of the cuts themselves, I think it's important to remember that 2 years is a long time, and that even after these cuts are made, that the Soviet superiority in many, many areas of conventional weaponry will still be there.
Mr. Ambassador, overall, the reaction to Mr. Gorbachev's speech yesterday, there seems to be a combination of great hope and, on the other hand, considerable cynicism. How would you evaluate it?
Well, I think hope and cynicism, or let's say hope and skepticism, is probably a good way to look at it. There were certainly positive elements in it. It was a big speech. There was no doubt of that. There were also some gifts that were not such happy gifts. For example, in the environmental section of the speech, a part directed at the international community, at the UN, we saw resurfacing, repackaged under environment, a World Space Organization idea, which is designed basically to kill our strategic defense initiative. So I think that's a poison pill.
Mr. Ambassador, one of your jobs is to keep your ear to the ground around the UN and find out what the reaction is there. It seems that, although we're having a somewhat reserved reaction to him, that within the UN he scored a triumph. Is that so? And if so, what can we do to regain the diplomatic initiative?
He did well at the UN because he said a lot of things that a lot of the countries wanted to hear. For example, the talk about debt. The Soviet Union doesn't hold much assets, and they don't deal very much. It's easy for them to give away other people's money.
And he's talking about forgiving third world debt.
Easy to forgive it. He's not a creditor.
Was that just boilerplate then?
Well, I don't know if it was boilerplate, but it certainly plays to the audience. Some of the other things on environment, we will go with him on that. There are common problems, and we need to address them. I think another aspect of the UN appearance was the novelty of it. This is the first Soviet leader to appear since Khrushchev 28 years ago, and at that time, most of the countries in the UN today did not even exist. So the novelty factor is real.
Mr. Ambassador, what's the next move now on conventional arms reduction in Europe? Whose move is it, and how will it be made?
We have been preparing carefully inside the NATO alliance. We will obviously have to take into account this latest proposal. We have called for symmetrical cuts in the past. They've apparently made a step here. It has to be studied. The alliance will do that. As you know, Secretary Shultz is in Brussels today, and this is bound to be high on his agenda.
You made the point earlier that about who's moving in whose direction. You said they're moving to us?
Well, they're coming towards us because they have to. They have a very heavy superiority in almost every aspect of armament in Europe. Before we can begin to talk about coming down together, they have to come down unilaterally. In that sense, they're coming towards us. And I think as long as we keep saying that and we stay firm, that let's hope they will continue to come towards us.
Mr. Ambassador, many thanks. Thanks for talking.
You're very welcome.
Back to Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Bob Abernathy and John Cochran at Kennedy Airport. Here in the studio with me is NBC's John Chancellor. We're just checking the wires here, John, and in Ankara, which is just across the border from where the earthquake took place, the capital of Turkey, of course, the Soviet consulate is saying, we don't normally ask for help, and we think that we have adequate facilities to deal with this. Whether or not they're in tune with the Kremlin, we don't know at this hour, because the devastation was so devastating that we'll have to see whether, in fact, Moscow reaches out to the rest of the world to try to get some assistance.
Well, I would think that when Gorbachev gets back there, gets to Yerevan, gets into control, I would think that he would be forthcoming on all of that. I mean, he remember that he praised Reagan, he praised Bush, he praised Shultz just yesterday at the UN, hands across the sea. Soviet-American relations have to improve. So I think if Armenians and other charitable organizations in the United States want to send supplies in there, I don't think the Russians will turn them down, ultimately.
And the fact of the matter is, it is one more opportunity for him to make the political point that he has been attempting to make, that this is a new Soviet Union. It is open to a new relationship with the rest of the world, West and East as well. Of course, he has other things on his mind, the dimensions of the tragedy at the moment, but the fact of the matter is that this is an opportunity for him that could grow out of a tragedy.
Well, wouldn't it be useful as well for Gorbachev, who's been having difficulty with Armenian nationalism, to set in motion a giant international relief chain for the Armenians? I think that would be both good politics and decent humanitarian objectives.
We'll just try to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of what's going on in that part of the Soviet Union. Armenia and Azerbaijani are two areas that are side by side. One is Muslim, the Azerbaijanis are Muslim, and the Armenians are Christian. And within Armenia is a section that the Azerbaijanis want to have control over once again, and they have been fighting over this. And in fact, there's been so much ethnic unrest that scores of people have been killed in that political squabble as well. So it has been a place of great political turmoil, and now a place of a great natural disaster. NBC's Andrea Mitchell, our White House correspondent, is there this morning, and she can report that President Reagan has been in touch with Mikhail Gorbachev before the Soviet president left the Soviet mission. Andrea?
In fact, it was an extraordinary telephone conversation. We had reported earlier that this conversation had taken place What we can now add to that is that Mrs. Reagan then got on the phone with Raisa Gorbachev. Let me bring you up to date, Tom. Apparently the president and President Gorbachev spoke for about 7 minutes. Of course, that does include translation. You know, we've made much of the personal relationship that developed between these two leaders since Geneva 1985 when they first got together, and it was a bit of a difficult first meeting. But since that time, that relationship has developed, and clearly in this phone conversation, more extensive conversation than the president usually has with foreign leaders, he not only expressed his sorrow and offered help and support, but said that he, first of all, deeply understood the reasons for Mr. Gorbachev returning. Let me just read you some of the quotations that the White House has now released. He said, "I know that I speak for all Americans when I express my deep personal sorrow at the loss of life. We understand that this was a very serious one. If there is any way that we can be of assistance, either bilaterally or through the international community, please let me know." He then goes on to emphasize the constructive nature of yesterday's talks. He said, "I want to tell you again how much both the Vice President and I enjoyed meeting with you yesterday. I think it was a very useful meeting for both sides. I wish you much success in the future and a safe journey home. Godspeed." We're told then that the General Secretary thanked him for his understanding and his condolences. And then Mrs. Reagan got on the phone for about 6 minutes with Raisa Gorbachev, of course, again, through translators, and said, "I also wanted to convey to you directly my personal sorrow and concern over this tragedy. I am so sorry. If we can do anything to help you, we're more than willing to. We look forward to seeing you either in the Soviet Union or California. Have a safe trip back." It's really quite startling considering the relationship that had developed between these two women. Even the thought of them visiting each other in Moscow or in California when the President and Nancy Reagan are out of office. In any case, I'm told by people who were there, and this was a telephone call, the joint phone call from the residence of the White House, that the General Secretary responded with great warmth. He did not directly accept the American offer for aid, but as you and John Chancellor were discussing, there was certainly a feeling to those in the room that he did not rule it out, and that this indeed might be something that Gorbachev would be able to do once he is on the ground in the region and assesses the situation.
Thank you, Andrea. There are a couple of other things we want to bring you up to date on. First of all, at Kennedy Airport, there was a bomb threat aboard a jet shortly after takeoff at Kennedy today. That sparked a frantic scramble, as you might expect, by security officers in the area from which Mikhail Gorbachev is scheduled to leave. A man has been arrested in that bomb threat, we're now told, and all is secure in the area where Mikhail Gorbachev's plane is now parked. It's in a remote part of Kennedy Airport, which is our international airport here in New York City, and so things are okay, but that only added to the chaos in the city today. Also in West Germany today, in the city of Remscheid, a United States Air Force jet carrying ammunition slammed into a residential area, setting buildings and homes on fire, and initial reports say that at least 5 people were killed, dozens were injured. Rescue officials said the death toll could rise. Authorities were fighting flames as they tried to reach the scene of the crash. It was an A-10 Thunderbolt II jet, a ground attack plane designed to support ground forces. It was carrying 1,000 rounds of 30-millimeter ammunition at the time of the explosion. The ammunition could explode on impact. Local officials said there were several explosions after the crash. If we get anything additional on that incident, we'll tell you as well. And now from Moscow, we are getting word that 13 foreign advisors to the Afghan guerrillas, the Mujahideen, including 6 Americans, were killed by guerrillas in Afghanistan on November 29th. A Soviet spokesman said today he will try to get additional information on that. Peter Kent now is standing by. He's the NBC News correspondent in Moscow this week. Peter, first of all, what's the latest on the earthquake? Any more on the death toll?
The latest at the moment, Tom, is still that only many thousands of people were killed and injured in the area. We're still waiting for the main evening newscast here in the Soviet Union, which will go to air about an hour from now. And we expect then, as usually happens here, to get much greater detail from the day's events and developments. We do understand that Home Guard units and the Soviet Red Army have set up several emergency camps. There are field operations units carrying out emergency operations. Several thousand people have been moved from the most severely affected area to Yerevan and to other cities away from the most severe destruction. And we have to remember that there were already 200,000 refugees in parts of these areas hit by the earthquake, people who were victims of the ethnic unrest in the past 7 months. between Armenians and Azerbaijanis over Nagorno-Karabakh, the enclave in between those two Soviet republics.
And do you have any word yet on what is going to happen when Mikhail Gorbachev arrives back in Moscow, what his plans are? There had been an earlier report, I think, that you gave us that he may just change planes and fly directly to the area.
Yes, we've been told by foreign ministry officials today that he is expected to go directly to Yerevan, almost directly. He will probably be briefed here, perhaps change aircraft or pick up an aircraft more suitably equipped to land in the quake-affected area. And we are given to understand that he will personally take command of the emergency operations unit that Central Committee members set up in Yerevan overnight.
Thanks very much, Peter Kent in Moscow. We'll be going back to you throughout the day as NBC keeps you posted on this tragedy of extraordinary proportions in Armenia, the earthquake, and then, of course, the political impact that it's had, the revision of Mikhail Gorbachev's plans. Just to give you some sense of the magnitude of this earthquake, it was 6.9 on the Richter scale, which is not at the top of the scale by any means. Remember that devastating earthquake in Mexico City in September of 1985? Well, that was 8.1 on the Richter scale. 9,500 were killed there. In Italy, we had one in 1980 of 7.2. This one that you're looking at now, Leninakan is the principal city in that part of Armenia, was 6.9, but the construction there is not of the highest possible quality. A lot of the homes in the rural areas, of course, are constructed of a kind of clay-like brick, and they are not well designed to withstand the tremors that come with that kind of an earthquake, even though that is an area heavily laced by earthquake faults. So that gives you some sense of what the earthquake situation is in that area. Armenians around the world are an extraordinarily tight-knit group. Armenia is a place that knows no boundaries in a way, and NBC's Bob Bazell now is with a prominent Armenian doctor in Southern California who has already been in touch with that region and is attempting to organize some rescue efforts. Bob?
Tom, with me is Dr. Varkas Najarian, who is the president of the Medical Outreach for Armenians. First of all, we said this earlier on the show, but let's repeat it. You spoke during the night to some people in the areas, and how bad is their reports of the devastation?
Yes, 5 o'clock this morning I spoke with the co-chairman of cultural relations with Armenians abroad, and he indicated to me that approximately 100,000 people have been killed, and probably 200,000 or 300,000 are wounded, injured.
Now, you also spoke to people in Armenia itself, is that correct?
No, primarily I've spoken to the committee.
Okay, so they've given you some information.
Yes.
Now, Americans aren't familiar, for the most part, with Armenia. It's December, winter is coming on. How cold, how difficult a problem do the survivors face?
It gets very cold, winter is setting in, so they're in dire need of blankets, warm sweaters, socks, shoes, protection, food, and nourishment.
You're a physician who've practiced in that area. How good is the medical care that is existing in that area?
Well, of course, the medical care is as good as it is in Russia, and it cannot be compared with the West, but they need help at this point, and we're trying to organize both medical supplies and also a group of physicians to go with us. Hopefully we can get the landing rights directly to Yerevan. And as a matter of fact, 5 minutes ago I talked to Dr. Gibbs from Florida, who has 12 physicians, and they have been to Mexico during the earthquake, and they're willing to go with us to Armenia and help us out.
Now, what is your sense of whether the Soviet authorities, without this sort of outside help, will be able to cope with the situation?
Well, I'm sure they'll be able to cope with the situation, but I feel the fact that when our people there see that the Armenians in the diaspora are giving them a helping hand, that will boost their morale considerably.
We've talked about the construction. Why do you think so many buildings fell down with an earthquake that is not that strong?
Well, first of all, Armenia does not have forests, so the houses are not cannot be built out of wood. Number one. Number two, steel is not as abundant as it is here, and we utilize a native stone called the doof stone. I think it probably the structure of the buildings are not as strong, or were not as strong as we thought they were.
Now tell us more about the ethnic strife. We've heard reports that there were 200,000 people in this area. There's been a lot of ethnic strife over many years in this part of the world. Is that not true?
Yes, there has been a lot of ethnic Okay, the misconception in the news media has been that the Armenians are rebelling against the Soviet Union. That's not so. For the past 70 years, when this section of Armenia called Artsakh or Karabakh, with the blessing of Stalin, was donated to the Azerbaijanis, the Armenians have suffered rape, murder, persecution, everything you can think of. Everything. So when Gorbachev came into power and gave them the freedom to talk, they voiced their opinion. They said they want to reunite with the motherland. Well, and this is the basic issue. It's not a nationalist problem. It's not a religious problem.
Well, and now, of course, they're suffering even much more terrible, severe problem of one of the worst earthquakes in modern times. Tom?
Unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Najarian and Bob Bazell. I'm told that we now have some recent pictures of the devastation in that part of Armenia. We have had already rescue efforts are underway. We're seeing these for the first time now. Soviet television has made them available.
Видели людей, их лица, полные невыразимой боли и скорби. Трагедия, которую не выскажешь словами. По предварительным данным, небывалое поселение снесло 2/3 Ленинакана. А город Спитак в 70 километрах от него
с населением
практически стерт с лица земли.
I'm not entirely sure just where these videotapes are coming from, but the devastation in those homes and buildings that we're looking at could hardly be more complete. Already rescue efforts are underway, which is itself a very tricky business. And we're back in New York now. We're watching the motorcade, which is on the far lane, coming toward the left-hand part of the screen. That's the Mikhail Gorbachev motorcade as it makes its way to John F. Kennedy Airport, with all of that security provided by the Soviets, the United States federal government, and New York City police, of course. We're not entirely sure which car the Soviet president is in. That lane of traffic was blocked off. As you can see, the lane of traffic coming into New York City was permitted to travel, but at a slower than normal rate of speed. In fact, what the traffic spotters call a lot of rubbernecking going on, and that's to be expected on a day when the leader of the Soviet Union is in the other lane going home on this dramatic and really poignant mission, cutting short his trip. We do expect liftoff from Kennedy between 12:30 and 1 o'clock today. It has been an exceptional 24 to 48 hours, of course, for Mikhail Gorbachev, because we cannot overlook the fact that he came here yesterday and stunned the world with his declaration that the Soviet Union would cut its force by 500,000 men in uniform, about 8% of the people that they have in uniform, and that included 6 tank divisions in Eastern Europe on the border with Western Europe. John Chancellor, as we have been looking at the reactions that we have been getting from Europe, it has been very well received there.
Well, he must be heartbroken, Gorbachev, that he can't ride the crest of this popularity that he's built up just in the last day or so into London, because he could use that as a platform for the propaganda he wants to offer. And it's a fairly simple equation. A lot of people in Europe do not want to spend as much on NATO as the NATO governments want to spend, and those governments don't want to spend as much as the United States thinks they ought to spend. And so when the Russians start cutting troops, 500,000 is quite a lot, the popular opinion in Europe is going to be, why should NATO go on spending all of that money? About $300 billion a year, half of it from us. And so he is missing this opportunity. If he goes back, that moment, the drama of his appearance before the UN will have evaporated to some extent, although he's still going to make a lot of mileage on it.
Yeah, and this is all highly speculative, of course, but the fact of the matter is, given his dexterity, once he deals with Armenia, I wouldn't be surprised, maybe even before George Bush is sworn in on January 20th, to see Mikhail Gorbachev crank up another trip to the West, not to this country necessarily, but a quick drive-through, if you will, of Great Britain and maybe even West Germany, because they have been courting the West Germans assiduously, trying to win favor there, and they've been pretty successful at it.
He's got some trips on his schedule now
that
are there, that he'll be able to make. So they won't let up on this business of, we have cut, why should you spend so much?
Yeah, he said yesterday, in fact, we now would like to see certain steps taken, and most people believe at least that he would like the United States to cut back on the number of attack aircraft that it has just across the border over there, because That's the attack aircraft are part of our big ace in the hole, that they're strong on the ground, we're strong in the air, and that's the kind of cut that he would like to see. NBC's Stan Bernard, who's just outside the Soviet mission from whence Mikhail Gorbachev has departed, has some additional information for us. Stan?
Well, Tom, you asked me earlier whether he spoke to anybody. Well, outside of his immediate delegation, the very large contingent, and of course speaking to the president and Raisa Gorbachev, speaking with Nancy Reagan, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of conversation. There was one incident here, though, I'd like to point out. There were 6 Armenian priests that came by in their full robes, and they came by and pleaded for an audience with Mr. Gorbachev, and he did not grant it. It was simply a very sad trip out of here, and he just wanted to get home, but there were no unusual conversations.
All right, thanks, Stan Bernard, outside the Soviet mission here in New York. The motorcade carrying the Soviet president now is approaching John F. Kennedy Airport, and it will fly directly. It's about a 10-hour flight from New York to Moscow, and then our guess is that the Soviet leader will get a quick briefing and probably go directly to a military installation in Armenia, where he will personally supervise the rescue operation. At Kennedy Airport, John Cochran and Bob Abernethy of NBC News. Gentlemen?
I was just thinking, Tom, Andrea Mitchell was reporting earlier from the White House about President Reagan's offer of help to Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev seemed to be appreciative. I wonder if every American realizes that Americans have helped the Soviets in the past. Even after the Bolshevik Revolution, Herbert Hoover organized a relief campaign which apparently saved millions of Soviet lives, and there was a terrible famine there. Herbert Hoover, of course, later became a president, albeit an unpopular American president. During World War II, a lot of Americans lost their lives on the run to Murmansk, as it was talked about. The American ships, with the Merchant Marine in particular, who went in there, torpedoed. A lot of Americans died. Many Soviets would have died without the food and supplies that came in there. Of course, some of it was military supplies. So there is a precedent for this, and I wonder if we're going to see American shipments going in there with that U.S. aid around the food parcels and so forth. Bob Abernethy?
The generosity and the need conflict a little bit with the traditional pride of the Soviet people and government, who don't want to appear to be anything less than fully competent to deal with their own problems themselves.
Part of the part of the problem is, as well, as John Chancellor was pointing out earlier, that the Soviet military hasn't been wild about the idea of letting a lot of military operations come in and set up and help, because they're always worried that they're going to learn too much.
Well, Tom, I remember old party that I am, the Agadir earthquake of 1959 in Morocco. 15,000 died in that, and within about 24 hours you had aircraft coming in there from almost every country in Europe and the United States. And it's more difficult for the Russian bureaucracy to respond that quickly the way the Moroccans did, but I think it'll happen.
One of the exceptional things that we all saw in Mexico City in September of 1985, when they had that devastating earthquake there, were these teams of specialists from around the world that I frankly didn't know existed. They came from France and from Sweden. Many of them were alpine specialists, because an earthquake and an avalanche have certain common characteristics. You've got to find people buried someplace. And they came in with their teams of dogs and their special equipment, and they were able to burrow into the rubble in a way that was really breathtaking, and knew how to deal with a collapsed building so that they could get in there, and they had the special equipment to shore it up, and they had these tiny and very courageous men who would find their way back in and then get people out of there. So there are those teams that are available around the world, and whether the Soviets will reach out to them, I don't know. And really, one of the most exceptional organizations on this planet is the Red Cross, the International Red Cross. And whether they'll be called in, we don't know. But they do know how to respond to this kind of a calamity. They have experts who work at it all the time. They have the equipment and the resources, and they can reach out to the various other nationalities around the world. They can come to the United States and get money and get supplies, and then it becomes a neutral organization, so we lose the politics of it all. We're back at Kennedy Airport now, and that's the motorcade that is carrying Mikhail Gorbachev to his plane. Ilyushin 62 is the They call those jets. Will fly him home. It's the Kremlin equivalent of Air Force One. That's a pretty quick trip to Kennedy.
Tom, this is Abernathy. As you can see, there is a podium set up here, just the way there was for the Gorbachev arrival, and we do expect him to have something to say before he leaves.
If you're trying to make out that those are Soviet limousines, not American. Is that a ZIL, John Chancellor?
I think it's a ZIL or a Chaika.
Yeah. Cavernous inside. If you've ever been in one, they quite ornate.
They've upgraded those cars, Tom. They used to be copies of American cars in the 1930s. I think they're now copies of American cars in the 1950s.
Selma Roosevelt, who handles protocol for the administration, is talking with the Soviet president. Raisa Gorbachev is just too hard by the right side of the screen. There she is. The Soviet president does appear that he's going to make some remarks.
Я хочу сказать, что я вынужден прервать мой визит, мою поездку и вернуться в Советский Союз. Вчера поздно вечером я получил известие о том, что землетрясение, которое произошло в Закавказье, в Армении в одном регионе оказалось очень тяжелым и с тяжелыми последствиями. Много разрушений и много человеческих жертв. Поэтому мне надо вернуться срочно домой, в страну. Сейчас уже действует комиссия под руководством председателя Совета Министров, который находится в районе бедствия.
I have to leave unexpectedly upon receipt of a very sad news about earthquake in Armenia. I have to be there in order to direct
оказавшимся в беде, тяжелой беде, принять все необходимые меры.
Direct all measures in order to alleviate the conditions of suffering people there.
To return to the Soviet Union, because late last night it was reported to me that the earthquake that struck the Transcaucasian republics of the Soviet Union, and particularly Armenia, was extremely severe and had extremely grave consequences, devastation, and great loss of life. So I urgently have to return to the Soviet Union. At present, a government commission is already at work, headed by the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union. It is already in the disaster area. Urgent measures are being taken to help all those affected by this terrible tragedy, and I have to be there in this effort.
Сегодня утром был у нас телефонный разговор с президентом Рейганом и вице-президентом Джорджем Бушем. Они выразили оба глубокое соболезнование от своего имени, от имени американского народа тем, кто пострадал, и сочувствие всему советскому народу и правительству. Я поблагодарил их за проявление, за выражение этих чувств, и хочу воспользоваться тем, что я выступаю, еще раз сказать от своего имени, от нашего народа и от тех кому были обращены слова президента и вице-президента, кто попал в беду. Самые искренние чувства благодарности, признательности за то, что было сказано. Мы очень это высоко ценим. Президент и вице-президент высказали свое желание оказать помощь, которая потребуется. Я хочу поблагодарить их и американцев за проявленные чувства сострадания и за желание прийти на помощь в этот трудный момент.
This morning, I had telephone conversations with President Reagan and Vice President Bush. Both of them expressed profound condolences on behalf of the American people to those affected and to the government and people of the Soviet Union. I thanked them for the expression of those feelings, and let me say it here again, on behalf of myself, of the Soviet people, and on behalf of those to whom those feelings of sympathy were expressed by the President and the Vice President, let me extend our deep gratitude and our profound appreciation. The President and the Vice President conveyed their willingness to extend assistance and appropriate help in this situation. I would like to thank them, and I would like to thank the American people for those feelings and for their readiness to give assistance in this difficult hour.
Получилось так, что был один только рабочий день. Но мы в делегации считаем, что это был очень важный день. Мы имели возможность изложить свои взгляды на сегодняшний мир, на его перспективы в Организации Объединенных Наций, организацию, которую мы высоко ценим и рассчитываем, что ее роль в строительстве новых международных отношений будет возрастать. Мы смогли осуществить многие полезные контакты в рамках Организации Объединенных Наций и иметь обмен мнениями с представителями многих стран. И это мы ценим. Мы встретили с их стороны понимание того, что мы высказали с трибуны ООН.
It has so happened that we have had only one working day here in New York. But I and my delegation believe that this was a very important day. We were able to set out our views at the United Nations on the world today and on the prospects of the world's development. We did that at the United Nations, an organization which we value very highly and whose role we believe will grow in the development of new international relations. We also were able to have a number of useful exchanges at the United Nations to talk to representatives of many countries, and we feel that they understand what we said at the United Nations.
У нас была встреча с президентом Рейганом и вице-президентом Бушем, будущим президентом Соединенных Штатов Америки, и членами нынешней и будущей администрации. И мы, и американская сторона едины в том, что это была очень важная встреча.